Great.
You didn't answer my question.
Yes, so I will. I'll try. The question was, how do you deal with little children in
Education.
Right, educating little children with the written Torah, the stories in Bereshit in particular. Some of the stories in Bereshit, they deal with concubines, they deal with murder, drunkenness. That's right. There's such uneducational things. What I found is a little rule of thumb that sort of I think it's a good expression of the Jewish tradition, and that is, you teach the Torah. We believe that the Torah is holy, and you don't go into too much detail if the child doesn't ask. Usually, children don't ask; they only ask when they're ready to hear an answer. So to them, it'll just be words. Okay, so he slept with her. They don't know what that means. He slept with her. He thinks he went to sleep, in the bed, slept in the same bed. Okay, what does that mean? So until they're ready to understand more, then they'll ask more questions. And so, I don't skip. Usually I don't skip. There's other approaches that say, okay, I'll do that chapter later when they get older. But I believe that it's also later on at other ages when you're learning already the Mishnah and the Talmud, and the kid's 10 years old, 13 years old. There's a lot of details about menstruation and about the Talmud has no filter. There's a lot of X-rated stuff, but you teach it, and if you give the approach that this is part of life, the Torah applies to life, it's a living Torah, then the child learns to integrate that and not to get shocked when he sees something like that in the future. And as I said, you don't go into great detail until they're ready to hear about it. But the censorship, it has its place when something's going to, just throw a kid off kilter and really hurt him. You don't want to hurt him. But usually if you're just reading the simple text, what they don't understand, they move on. And what they do understand is great, and they'll learn to accept it. This is part of life, that everything can be dealt with in a Torah way. I think that's my general approach. Okay, so let's go back to the introduction of the Mishnah of the Rambam. Last session, we read the first half of chapter 1. And Renan, we just show everybody the book I showed you because I didn't have any more copies. I just pulled out. We actually have it. Just show us the book, the physical book. Show everybody. You can see that Maimonides' Introduction to the Talmud, right? I wrote Introduction to the Mishnah because he didn't really write a commentary on the Talmud. The Talmud usually includes the Gemara too. All he has is a commentary on the Mishnah. It's a Mishnah commentary. In any case, there it has in a book form. Sorry?
He died too early before he got to it?
Oh, I don't think so.
No,
I think he didn't plan on it. No. He obviously, he pulled the halachot, the halachot from all the discussions of the Talmud. But he actually writes in one of his introductions that his plan is to have a book, 1,000 chapters, one book, instead of the 63 different books, which in a more organized fashion, that essentially will summarize and maybe even replace the Talmud. This was his, I'll say it, a little megalomaniac tendency. People got very angry at him, and obviously it didn't work. We still study the Talmud today, but the point was that he wanted everybody to have access to the Talmudic teachings, to the Jewish tradition, but the form of the Talmud with the Aramaic and the discussions back and forth, and it's so confusing, so difficult. It's like in this class, we put it in a black box. So I don't teach any Talmud. I don't know if you noticed that, right? When you're ready at the next stage, there is a class in beginner's Talmud and there's advanced Talmud. By all means, it's the foundational book of Judaism. But to get the big picture and to understand what the tradition is telling us, sometimes it's not the best pedagogic method to go straight and dive into the Talmud. And so that's why the Rambam wrote his book, the big book, the Mishnah Torah. Anyways, we're learning his introduction because we're back to understanding about the Torah and how it was given, and the written Torah and the oral Torah. So we're on page 2, the second page. We left off And when the prophet, the third paragraph from the top of the page. Jacob, will you read for us, please?
Yes, and when the prophet, peace be upon him, came, this commandment and its explanation was given to him, and so too with all the 613 commandments, they in their explanation, the commandment in writing, and the explanation orally. And it was in the 40th year, in the 11th month on Rosh Chodesh, the first of Shvat, that Moshe gathered the people and said to them, the time of my death has arrived.
Wait a minute. What day? What year?
40th year,
40th year, 11th month.
11th month. What's the 11th month?
Shvat.
And which day of Shvat? First day of Shvat.
That's today.
What? It's tomorrow. Tomorrow's Rosh
Tomorrow,
Chodesh.
yeah.
Tomorrow's Rosh Chodesh Shvat. Wow.
Oh, wow. What do we do?
We should be learning this tomorrow.
Do
We're preparing.
we have any special things to do for tomorrow?
We do, absolutely. Gonna have lots of special things.
I don't mean we as in like us. I mean like, is there any like
Yeah, special practices of Rosh Chodesh. There's a special Torah reading, a special Hallel we say in the prayer
but
service.
specifically on like for Shvat?
No.
No.
No, they're more towards the middle of the month, Tu B'Shvat, the 15th of Shvat.
Okay.
That's
So
coming.
we don't. Okay, never mind. Okay.
But what happened on that day? So when is and Moshe? When did Moshe die? Does anybody know? It's a tradition. It doesn't say in the Torah exactly when, but our tradition is that. No. Every same day he was born. That's true. 120 years, right? And every day they commemorate Moshe's birthday and death day. The burial society has their yearly convention on the day that Moshe died. Do you know why? What was special about Moshe's death?
His body went with him, no? Wait.
What happened to his body?
Nobody knows.
Well, nobody knows where he was buried.
Other side of the Jordan.
Sounds like God. God buried him.
Yeah.
So it says the holiest burial ever. So that day, the burial society has that. It's like the day of the ultimate burial. It's Zayin Adar, the 7th of Adar, which is the next month after Shvat. So Moshe is now speaking on the first day of Shvat, the 11th month. Right? Adar is the 12th month. So how many days before he dies?
About
A month and a quarter?
37 days. Right? Maybe 38 days if you want to count it as a full month. Let's say 40 days. It's close. 40 is a good number, right? With a lot of things that are 40 days. Basically, this is the ending speech of Moshe. Go ahead, Jacob. Read it again. In the 40th year.
in the 40th year, in the 11th month on Rosh Chodesh, the first of Shvat, that Moshe gathered the people and said to them, the time of my death has arrived, and if there is from among you someone who heard a law and forgot it, he should come to me and ask me, and I will elucidate it. And anyone who has doubt about a question, he should come and I will explain it to him. As is stated, Moshe undertook to expound this Torah saying.
Wow. Keep going.
And so did the sages say in Sifrei Devarim 1:5. Anyone who forgot a law, let him come and review, and anyone who needs an explanation, let him come and have it explained. And they took elucidations of the laws from the mouth and studied
From his mouth.
from his mouth and studied the explanations of all of that time from Rosh Chodesh Shvat until the 7th of Adar.
Okay, so we have the final review period, right? Moshe was the origin, the white light, and they've been studying for 40 years in the desert throughout all the different mitzvot with all their explanations. And now Moshe says, okay, last chance. If you have a question, do it now. And you can imagine that they were really, really cramming for an exam. You know what I mean? You're trying to get it all in, and because they all know that their teacher Moshe is going to die. Wow, powerful. Okay, so this is the last month of Shvat. The month of Shvat is a good month for learning Torah, like that last year in the desert before Moshe died, at the end of the 40 years. Okay, so again, all the mitzvot and their explanation come from Moshe, from Sinai. Very clear. Now, the next part is a little complicated, but it's fascinating, and that's why we're reading it. Go ahead. So who else? Amos, maybe you'll read next.
And when it was before his death, he began to write the Torah in books, and wrote 13 books of the Torah, all of them on pergament,
Parchment.
from the letter Bet in Bereshit, the first word in Torah, to the letter Lamed in Leinei Kol Israel, the last phrase in Torah, Baba Batra 15 Aleph. And he gave a book to each and every tribe to behave according to it and to walk in its statutes. And the 13 books he gave to the Levites and said to them, Deuteronomy 31:26, take this book of the Torah. Afterward, he went up to the mountaintop in the middle
In the middle of the seventh day, Sifrei Hazino, it's just where it comes, right?
Seventh day of the month of Adar, as the tradition inferred.
Okay, stop there. So this, in one paragraph, the Rambam writes, Moshe wrote the whole Torah 13 times, one for each tribe, and that was a busy month. So here we have to add a little bit, and the Rambam talks about it in other places, but when we say that Moshe wrote the Torah, it's really not explicit anywhere in the Chumash that he wrote the entire Torah. It's inferred. It sounds like it, but the verses are a little bit ambiguous. Definitely at the end of his life, there's a poem. We spoke about it, Ha'azinu, the Ha'azinu poem, which he was told, write this and teach it to the Jewish people. But in terms of writing the whole book, here we have a machloket that I think I mentioned the other day. If I didn't, I'll talk about it now. Some people say that Moshe wrote the entire book of the Torah only at the end, like the Rambam just described. Before that, he was teaching orally. Maybe people wrote little bits in their scrolls to remember stuff, as he said. But essentially, the scroll of the Torah, he wrote at the end of the 40 years. And the Rambam says, from the beginning, first letter, to the last. We believe that the whole Torah comes from Moshe, this book. But it's fascinating, there's a machloket. Another opinion in the Tanaim says, no, the Torah was given to the Jewish people scrolls by scrolls. The Hebrew words are Torah, Chatuma, didnt. It was given, sealed as one unit. And the other opinion is Torah Megillot Nitna. It was given scrolls by scrolls. In other words, it could be after each one of these days, if he was teaching the laws of Sukkah, for example, and then he would, as he intimated earlier, that Moshe would write it down in a scroll. And that scroll was part of the Torah that later on got put together with all the other scrolls. And the next day there was an entire scroll about the tefillin. Another day, a scroll on, shechita. Another day, a scroll on, and we already mentioned last time that there were apparently scrolls with the narrative stories of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, which the Jewish people were telling their children on Shabbat afternoon in Mitzrayim. Remember we talked about that? So it could be that there was lots and lots of scrolls, and this is the way the Torah was developed. But ultimately, our tradition says that that's up until 40th year, the end of Moshe's life. Then he gave it the combination, or the version which God told him to put together. It's all from the Word of God. God told him to put it together in this way, whether all at once at the end of 40 years or section by section over the course of the 40 years. This is all for the Torah from Hashem to Moshe, and then he wrote it and gave 13 versions of it to each and every tribe. Okay, is that clear? You have a question or none? Yeah.
Actually, Torah, it's the 4 first books, right? Because the
fifth book,
Deuteronomy,
Deuteronomy.
they have a different structure. They have a different way to write and speech. It's the speech of Moses.
Right, it's a good question. It's a good question because the fifth book is definitely different. The way it's written, right, at the beginning of the Book of Deuteronomy, it says, these are the words that Moshe spoke to all the Jewish people. at the end of the 40 years. Essentially, the Devarim is one long speech or a few speeches of Moshe.
Deuteronomy?
Deuteronomy. Yeah. But as the Rambam just told us, it's considered to be part and parcel of the 5 books of Moses. So even though it does have a different character, it still gets this the status of being part of the Chumash meaning 5, Chamesh, right? 5 books. So there are differences. It's fascinating to talk about. When we get to the Book of Dvarim, maybe we'll talk about it more. What are the differences? But the very basic difference, you're absolutely right. It says the beginning of the beginning of Bereshit. It doesn't say, and God said to Moshe. It tells the story, and it teaches us the mitzvot. And then, but at the beginning of Devarim, it all says that Moshe was retelling the story and speaking and teaching, giving instruction to the Jewish people, according to what we just learned now in the introduction to the Mishnah. The Rambam said Moshe was giving speeches the entire 40 years, right? Every day he was teaching 4 hours, right, in a row, and then going to play golf, right? Remember that? So whatever he was doing, but Moshe was throughout his life he was teaching them. So there's something special though about that book of Deuteronomy, which says, before I die, I want to retell the story. I want to, give you specific mitzvot, which he repeats. Other mitzvot he mentions for the first time. It's a fascinating piece of history to try to figure out exactly how it worked. But you're right, the book of Dvarim is a little different.
So like, we can assume that the 4 books was like, or dictate or give to Moshe, or I don't know, like the Torah, Khan, and the Devarim, like was someone writing like the speeches, or Moshe writing.
He wrote it himself. Our tradition says that Moshe wrote every word, like the Rambam just described, and some of them were his own words. People write their own speeches. The trickiest part, of course, comes when you reach the last 8 verses in the Torah. Because what's the 8th last verse of the Torah at the end of Devarim?
Passes away.
It says that Moshe went up and died. So did he write about himself that he died? So it's a possibility. It's a debate. That's right. Some people say he was writing with tears in his eyes. God told him, right, that Moshe went up to die. So he knew he was dying. Because the reason why these people say that is because of the tradition. Every word from the first letter to the last letter, it's the word of God to Moshe. So it's got to include the last 8 verses, even when it says that Moshe died. Other people say, no, the last 8 verses, who wrote them? Joshua. Some people say it was Joshua. By the way, did you notice what's the first letter of the Torah? What's the last letter of the Torah? Lamed. What does that spell? Lev, heart. Yeah. Torah is our heart. Nice. Somebody had a question here? You want to know?
That was my question about Joshua.
About Joshua. So it's a debate whether Joshua wrote that last 8 verses. And yes, Renan.
The Torah says that Moshe was teaching like from the morning until the evening, like, when
Yitro came.
Yitro came. So it's like it was all day long teaching the people.
Unless he was playing golf. I told you that already. What?
Yeah. So it wasn't like actually 4 hours.
I was an example. You're absolutely right. I just said for an example, if each mitzvah takes an hour lesson and then an hour to repeat it, another hour to the Aaron repeated, another hour such and such. I was just giving an example. It could be the mitzvah was 5 minutes that day. It's a short one. Don't have milk and meat. Okay.
But there was periods.
Oh no, there's entire books written on that one line. So maybe there was some details that he had to tell them about that. Okay, let's finish off the piece, and then I want to show you another one if we have time. Yes, Amos, you have a question?
I mean, the tablets have been written on the stone.
Correct. This is not the tablets. This is parchment, right? Yeah.
And is there any difference between stones and paper or the skin? It's like the higher level of it takes longer, or is there any other explanation to it? Or I mean, in the Mishkan was just the tablets there, or it was also the scroll.
There's a tradition that there was a shelf next to the Holy Ark that for the scroll. So there was both there. But you're right, it's fascinating. I think it's very symbolic that there's a part of the Torah which is written in stone and a part which is written on parchment. And it really gets to the heart of what we're discussing here. The Rambam is making a big point to tell you that all this oral tradition, right? It's this introduction to the Mishnah. Right? What's the Mishnah? That's the oral Torah. The first statement in a book form of an oral Torah, which is not supposed to be written down. And he says, don't think that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi made all this stuff up in year 200. These are all based on traditions which Moshe was teaching way back in the Sinai, 1,500 years before this. And the origin of the Mishnayot, right? Not only do we have halachot, which are halacha l'Moshe Sinai, perhaps some of the formulations of the Mishnah are so ancient. There's a few Mishnayot which the scholars point out that they have the mark of being ancient, of being older than the others. Obviously, when it says Rabbi Yehuda says this and Rabbi Meir says this, they lived in year 170 CE. That doesn't come from 1,000 years earlier. But sometimes the Mishnah doesn't have specific people saying, but they're like haiku poems. Beginning Bava Kama, Hashor, Dabor, Amav Eva Ever, Arba Avot Nezikin. These are the 4 types of damages. Could be those are the words of Moshe Rabbeinu. And there's other Mishnayot in Kiddushin. Shum Kesef, V'shave Kesef. They're not even full sentences. They're just sort of like, statements. Like I said, they're very laden and they're like poetry. And it could be that that's really the tradition that was passed down throughout the centuries about these specific laws. And of course, the Jewish people have been studying the exact meaning of these short sentences, just like we're studying the short meaning of the psukim. Right? It says, sit in booths for 7 days. But what about all those details? So this was all studied for years and years. Fascinating. Yeah. Okay, let's finish it off because then I want, if we have time, I want to show you something else. Then we're going to do something special this week. On Tuesday, there's a special lesson on Techelet, which is an additional mitzvah. It's part of the mitzvah of tzitzit. So just like we had a day or two sessions about tefillin, I'd like to do some sessions on tzitzit with you this week to get ready. And then you'll have the special lecture about the blue string, the Techelet's, the blue string that, some people want to revive and renew that mitzvah was for... but there's a lot more to learn about tzitzit than just the blue string. So I'm going to take, hopefully this week, and give you a preparatory lesson about the laws of tzitzit in general, so that we'll get the benefit of having the special lecture on Tuesday about the Techelet as well. And then we'll discuss it, okay? So either tomorrow or Tuesday, we're going to have a special session on tzitzit. I hope to actually teach you how to tie tzitzit.
Oh, I'd like to learn that.
I'm sure you would. Me too.
You know how to?
I go back to my grade 4 teacher who taught me how to tie tzitzit.
I guess we need to practice it.
I always tied mine down.
All right, let's finish up the Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah. Renan, will you read for us, please? It's a little bit of different translation. So, Russell, you take it away then. And that event, you can rest, Renan. Yeah. And that event that happened,
They called death in our eyes, because we lost him and remembered him, and life for him in honor of the heights that he reached.
so for us it was death, Moshe died, but for him it was life, because, he went up to a higher place, a spiritual place.
And so too, they said, and so topic can be, Moshe, our teacher, peace be upon him, did not die, but rather he went up and is serving above. And the things about these matters are very expansive, and this is not their place.
So we're not going to get into this. The Rambam says, I'm not going to get into this tradition. This tradition, Moshe didn't die. It doesn't mean that he didn't die. He died. He died in this world, and for us, in terms of a human, he died, of course. But his spirit, as we spoke about it in another class, lives on. Matters of spiritual souls don't necessarily die. They don't get cut off. Where do they go? What did we say? The Rambam said, Olam Haba. That's right. So go ahead. And when he died,
And when he died, peace be upon him, since he bequeathed to Yeshua that which was imbued to him of the explanation, Yeshua and the people of his generation applied their wisdom and their thought to the received Torah, and everything that he received from Moshe, he or any of the elders, there is nothing to say about it, and no disagreement arose about it. And whoever did not hear an explanation from the mouth of the prophet, peace be upon him, about matters that derived from them, extrapolated laws by propositions from the 13 exegetical principles through which the Torah is expounded, which were given at Mount Sinai.
oh, so this is something new already, right? Up till now, pretty much the Rambam's been describing TT. Remember? Transmitted tradition. Transmitted. Moshe got the law and all its details. And he transmitted it to Aaron, to the sons, to the elders. Everybody studied it for 40 years. At the end, Moshe died. He said, whatever you need fixing, we'll ask now. There was a solid body of transmitted tradition. But now he says, wait. We find that our Torah tradition includes not only transmitted tradition, we also have inspired innovation. Now, you can't just make up stuff because you say, oh, I'm inspired, I'll innovate. No. The Rambam said they were given 13 rules of how to derive laws from the verses, from the body of tradition that they had. It was supposed to be like DNA. It was supposed to be, let me give you a better example, more modern scientifically. They're like stem cells. Right? The stem cells can develop in many different directions. Can develop and create many things that they're in there, but they have to be brought out. They have to be refined. So here too, this concept of innovating through extrapolating laws from these principles. This is something that developed, of course, more so after Moshe was dead, and they didn't have answers to the new questions. Well, what are we going to do? We've got no tradition on that, so we're going to derive what the Torah law is from the tradition that we have. So there's the inspired innovation. Okay? Keep going. And among those laws?
And among those laws that they derived, there are some things wherein no disagreement arose, but rather they agreed about them. And there were among them those wherein disagreements between two opinions did arise. This one says like this, and that one says like that. This one reasons according to his reasoning and becomes more sure of his opinion, and that one reasons according to his reasoning and becomes more sure of his opinion. As principles of analysis that are by way of argumentation will result in such a result.
So the Rambam says it's a natural thing that there's going to be debates. More and more debates came up. When you're getting farther and farther away from the pure transmission, and more into the realm of derivations and of explanations and extrapolations. Some people, they extrapolate in one direction. Other people are going to extrapolate in another direction. So you're going to get disputes. You're going to get machloket. This is his introduction to the Mishnah, right? The Mishnah, the Talmud, full of almost every Mishnah, or every second Mishnah has a machloket. Machloket, a dispute, an argument between these rabbis and that rabbis. Why they each one derives it differently. They understood differently from the original material which they had. Go ahead. What do you do about that? What do we have? 2 Torahs?
Yep.
Nope. Only 1 Torah.
No, oral Torah and
Right. Oral Torah and written Torah. But what are you going to do with the, Rabbi Yossi felt you could have chicken and milk. And the rabbi said you can't have chicken and milk. So what do we do?
Go by the majority.
Go by your mincha.
Listen, go ahead. Ariel, you read it.
And
When a disagreement would arise,
they would go according to the majority as it states. Exodus 23:2. You will incline after the majority.
Okay, so that's a very almost, it's based on a pasuk in the Torah. Follow the majority rule. Everybody thinks democracy, oh, that's a Greek thing, right? Because, the majority rules. No, it's the basic principle of majority rules is from the Torah. How it applies, of course, that is usually stated. The original context is in the context of a beit din. When you have, 6 people say he owes them the money, and 5 people say he doesn't owe them the money, so you follow the 6 people, and you would decide based on the majority, even if it's not unanimous. But the principle is the Rambam says that's because we want to have only one Torah. We want all Jewish people to do everything. So in the day, the truth is, Rabbi Yossi Aglili himself and his students could have chicken with milk, but we, years afterwards, we follow the majority. The majority opinion was that you're not allowed. Majority opinion is that chicken and milk is forbidden. And so we follow that, and basically the next generation has to follow the majority of the rabbis, unless you happen to be a descendant of Rabbi Yossi Aglili yourself, and you somehow can prove that, you're up to, nothing you can do. No, in any case, no cheeseburgers. So you follow the majority. That's a basic rule of keeping our system together as a cohesive Torah. We have to have some kind of rule of law, or else it would be everybody doing something else. We wouldn't have one tradition. So we follow the majority, but that's not essential. Essentially, all those different extrapolations are considered to be kosher, literally and figuratively. They're kosher interpretations, extrapolations, derivations from the body of transmitted tradition. Yes, Jacob.
2 questions. First, did the majority rules idea apply like the Sanhedrin?
Yes.
Okay. And the second question I have, has there been any cases, kind of like as you mentioned, like some random rabbi said chicken and milk? Have there been any more like well-known cases where that hasn't, the idea of majority rules hasn't been, the opposite kind of happened?
Yeah, everything has happened. It's been a long time since Moshe. And yes, it's amazing history of our tradition.
So there's been cases where majority rules hasn't happened.
Well, it could happen, and see what happens is that a position could be a minority position at first, and then a few years later, some rabbis say, well, actually that makes more sense, and so it gets popularity, and eventually the majority will come and be like the original minority opinion. So
maybe a better question to ask: are there some things that are now like, they're like in the majority opinion that we do on like a regular basis, but at one point they were like a very fringe minority type of thing? Does that make sense?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. There's lots of twists and turns of the way the tradition developed. I think I mentioned to you a while back that there's a tradition about when the day starts and when the day ends, about what sunset. And Rabbeinu Tam's opinion is that there's a much later sunset.
We were talking about
a much later.
Or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So,
okay, fair enough.
So with that, up until a few hundred years ago, the majority of the Jewish world was following Rabbeinu Tam's opinion. But somehow, miracles, somehow now, almost nobody does that. I mean, they do that as a chumrah, but we don't. Once the sun sets, we consider that the beginning of the next day. We have to be careful about whatever, if next day is Shabbat, etc. We don't light the candles and so forth. So there is all sorts of twists and turns in the way we practice. And that's why the Talmud says, what do we need all those opinions in the Mishnah for? If one guy's in the minority, another guy's in the majority, just leave out the minority. He's going to lose. The Talmud says, well, now he's in the minority, but who knows? Maybe in a later generation, the rabbis will rediscuss the case, and they'll see that for our generation, for whatever reasons, they'll say, you know what, I think that other opinion makes more sense. And we'll use that minority, that what was a minority opinion, it will now become a majority opinion. And so that's why the Talmud records all the debates, because all those are rejected opinions. They're not really rejected. They're just one of the 70 facets of the Torah. We talked about the elders all teaching the Torah, they each one with a different perspective. So they're all part of the Torah discussion, they're all using the mechanism, the 13 principles, they're all deriving. Even though in practice we have to choose one, it doesn't mean that the other one's wrong. It's a hard concept to wrap your head around, that there could be many elements of truth. And maybe in the future, one day, practice will change. And that other, it's like, if I show you Renan's shirt,
What does it say?
It's is it black or gray? I'm trying to say it's a. My coat is black, right? My coat is black, more black than his, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. So that means that his sweater has a little bit of white in it. It's not absolutely black, right? It's gray. Gray has a little bit of black and a little bit of white in it. So shades of gray. There's someone, if someone to say that shirt is black and someone else would say that shirt is white, they'd both be right.
There's whiteness and blackness to it.
Exactly. So it's like the cup of coffee. Now not the cup of coffee is half empty, I can see, but sometimes it's half full. If it's steaming, it would be half full. But anyways, okay. Questions, Russell, please.
So, just like in a hypothetical scenario, building off of, I guess what we were talking about before was Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, and chicken and
Yep.
milk. So it's like, so just using that as an example. So what would it take for the Jewish world to shift from a status quo of this generation to a minority opinion or like a new opinion? Like, would it take like a new Sanhedrin, or like, how does that happen?
When it's something like that, like an argument of the Rabbi Yossi the Galilean, he was a Tana, right? It's the Mishnah period, and to go back and to all the way back and make a change of Jewish practice, going back to the Mishnah, that you might need a Sanhedrin.
Okay.
That's a major shift, which you really would need a consensus and an authorized Beit Din. But there are smaller questions of practice, like I was talking to you about the way we work the calendar, the timing of the day, that you don't need a Sanhedrin for. It's really a question of the rabbis of the community and the greater rabbis and more rabbis and then the rabbis of the entire country and then the number of countries, and it becomes the practice can change between different communities and so forth. So it really depends. Some things are more written in stone, and some things are more flexible. So it's hard to give you a one answer.
I was reading over Shabbos. I want you to confirm if what I read was correct. It's that if there's ever a dispute between someone from an Amoraim and a Tanaim, that we go with the Tanaim. Is that correct?
Almost. It's true that the Tanaim have more authority. They're closer to Sinai, right? They're closer to Moshe in that tradition than the Amoraim. But to be more correct, it's almost never that Amora will have the gall to disagree with a Tana. It's almost like an unwritten rule. The tradition tells us all of the Amoraim, after the Mishnah was closed by Rabbi in year 200, so the Amoraim discussed, wrote the Talmud for hundreds of years. They took it upon themselves. We are never going to disagree with the Mishnah. We don't have the authority. If it's written down in the Tannaitic source, we don't argue. What they do, though, is they say, well, I'm not going to go head to head because a Tana against an Amora is going to lose. The Amora is going to lose. But they'll say, I'll reinterpret his words. He didn't mean that. His words, when he said it was kosher, he only meant in a very specific situation, and so forth. So there's a lot of discussion of the Tanaim, but as a general rule, there's always exceptions, but as a general rule, Amoraim don't have the authority to disagree with Tanaim. Yes.
I need your help because as I'm looking on my translation in Shemot 23:2 or here, it seems like the it's saying is a negative thing that they follow the evil talk about. Like the more people is talking. I mean, if I read it here in English or in Czech, it seems like if someone's saying some light thing that we shouldn't follow him, even if we have an inclination to do it. And the Rambam,
Who follow who? Follow what are we talking about?
I don't know if it's right translated. I'm asking about.
I don't know what you're talking about. So read the verse in English. Read it in English. First, Shemot 23. Go ahead. Read what you're asking about.
Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil.
Okay.
Neither shall thou bear witness in a case.
I understand now. I understand.
Aside
Okay.
after the multitude to pervert justice.
That's right.
And he's using that as our inclination to do it?
No.
To follow
These verses were understood in our tradition, the traditional explanation that Moshe gave when he was, reciting these laws, to be in the context of a court, as I mentioned before, the court system. The court system follows the majority and not the minority. But then there's what happens when you have a capital case, for example. Capital case, we call it nowadays what's called a simple majority is not enough. If you have 6 against 5, you can't, let's say he's guilty and he has to be put to death. We don't put him to death. It has to be 7 to 5. Or again, the numbers are not right because there's a specific set number of judges. But you can't have just a simple majority. There has to, so that's like to do evil, meaning what they mean in the context is like to put someone to death. So you can't just by a simple majority put someone to death. So there's a traditional explanation of those verses. You're right, it's very complicated when you just read the text to understand the context. But the way our tradition explains it is that in general we follow the majority, but when you're going to do something that's a very extreme, like capital punishment, there's limits on that majority. It has to be a greater majority and so forth. But okay, it's good you looked up the pasuk. Renan, thank you for waiting.
When exactly was writing the Talmud?
The Palestinian Talmud, they say, is about 500, and the Babylonian Talmud around 700, 700. CE.
CE.
Yeah, 1,500 years ago. Okay.
So it's after the second temple.
After the second temple, correct. Right, that's right. During the Tanaic period, the temple was destroyed. The second temple was destroyed, and the rabbis basically had to come up with a Judaism which replaced the temple-centric religion.
So they start to do the comments of the Mishnah, in the Mishnah.
Yes. Then they put together the Mishnah. The Mishnah were teachings of the Tanaim, of all these extrapolations. We have to stop here. B'ezrat Hashem. To be continued. This was the first chapter of the Rambam's introduction. It's a whole book, right? The Renan's holding the book. It's an entire book, his introduction to the Talmud or the Mishnah, and the other chapters speak more about prophecy and how that comes into the play. But basically, the Rambam's position is that after this period, when we're talking about the Tanaim and the Amoraim, prophecy doesn't have a role. The prophecy's finished, First Temple time, and from now on, the rabbis take those 13 principles and derive and extrapolate TT and II, right, to this day.
TT and II for the win.
TT and II for the win.
FTW.
Have a great day. Have a great week. Stay healthy.
See you tomorrow. Or actually later today.
Later.